Good afternoon. This is the last panel, and we are going to talk about colonial and post-colonial nation of citizenship. And I would like to say thank you to Marla for inviting me to this conference. And before to introduce our speakers, let me say a few words about the topic. I'm not an expert on the citizenship, but it occurred to me during the discussion an idea. Yesterday evening I was watching Sanremo. Sanremo is the most popular, the most famous Italian musical competition. And there was on the stage to present the singer, Paolo Egonu. Paolo Egonu is a very important volleyball player. And on the stage she said, why people and why the Italians ask me if I'm Italian? No? It's a simple question, but I think it's important to understand the connection between the legal idea of citizenship and the material citizenship. I use the word material like citizenship, like Mortati idea of material constitution. The idea is that constitution, and we can say also citizenship is not only law and legal aspect, but also something that is linked with practice, with behavior, with custom. Sorry, but and now I'll introduce our speaker. The first one is Sabina Donati. She is working as research associate at Pierre Dubois Foundation for Current History in Switzerland. She was postdoctoral research assistant in many places, at Stanford University of California, at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. And she's working now here in Rome on research on the Roman question analyzed through the citizenship lens. And she wrote a very important book. The title is, we have seen the image before, the title is A Political History of National Citizenship and Identity in Italy, 1861-1915, and the book was published by Stanford University Press in 2013. She interested in the connection between empire and citizenship, and between citizenships and nationhood. She highlighted the importance to analyze citizenships as a hybrid and dynamic idea that change in the different place, in the different for geographical reasons and for historical reasons. So welcome, Sabina Donati.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Stone, for this kind invitation. My presentation today focuses on boundaries of citizenship and notions of Italianità as they emerge from my research findings by looking at the ins, the outs, and the in-betweens of Italian colonialism and Italian colonial citizenship strategies in both North Africa and East Africa during the interwar period. In a reserved note of May 1939, you can see it on the screen, a note that is now kept in the archive of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. We can read, Il Duce has confirmed the opportunity to study a type of citizenship to be granted to Eritreans and Somalis. We are in May 1939. Eritreans and Somalis were colonial subjects at that time, holding the colonial subjecthood of Italian East Africa. And on the basis of this archival document, we can deduce that Italian authorities in Rome discussed the issue of upgrading the status of these natives with the introduction of a type of citizenship that unfortunately I cannot describe because the archival documentation has many gaps, and also because it is possible that this policy was actually put aside due to the outbreak of the Second World War. However, even if we don't know whether this citizenship was introduced or not, the archival document is particularly interesting because it shows how citizenship, the juridical cord linking an individual to a state and linking many different populations to an empire, was a pencil used by the Italian colonial state to draw a hierarchy of colonial subjecthood and citizenship statuses that could vary and whose lines of inclusion and exclusion could evolve and move according to the specific native group under consideration by Italian authorities, according to Eurocentric notions of civilization and race, and also according to the foreign policy objectives of the colonizing power. Now, bearing in mind this archival document and the fact that citizenship is a pencil, as I emphasized in my Stanford book, A Political History, I would like to present my paper by covering these two parts. In part one, I want to complicate the whole story straight away by starting with the in-betweens. Those were between two cultures, the Italian and the African, between two legal worlds, Italian metropolitan citizenship and colonial subjecthood, and who could navigate across the colonial divide. And the in-betweens I will discuss today are on the one side the North African natives who were allowed to naturalize in Libya so as to become Italian metropolitan citizens, and on the other side the Italo-African children who in East Africa could or could not be eligible to Italian metropolitan citizenship, iure sanguinis. Then in the second part, I will move from the in-betweens to the outs and look at them in contrast to the ins. In other words, I shall look more closely at those targeted colonial orders from whom the ins, the Italian colonizers, were to be differentiated on the basis of specific principles and criteria that varied during the interwar period and that were to follow the radical fascist turn of the regime. My overall purpose is to highlight so-called tensions of empire, to mention the pioneering book edited by Frederick Cooper and Anne-Laura Stoller, Tensions of Empire, meaning the complexity of imperialism, the dilemmas of colonial rule, and the controversial and debated citizenship issues that rose at that time in a specific territory or across the empire. And also, a second objective is to discuss issues of discrimination and exclusion in reference to Italian colonial racism in its anti-Black and anti-Jewish variants, without forgetting to emphasize the specificity of the Italian case due to the project of totalitarianism that was supposed to be realized at home and in the empire by fascist Rome. So let's start with part one, the in-betweens in Italy's African colonies. In the course of Italian colonialism within a context of power relations, some individuals in the colonies were in a position where they could cross the colonial juridical divide that the Italian state, as many other European imperial countries, had been trying to create, shape, and defend in its overseas colonial territories. This was a juridical and imagined colonial divide that was regarded at that time as necessary for the expanding colonial state in order to distinguish the colonizers from the colonized, the dominant European power from the dominated African subjects or African colonial citizens. Now, in the Italian archives, I have been able to find some interesting material which puts into question this clear opposition, colonizers, colonized, making the colonial, juridical, and political environment much more complicated. In fact, following the First World War and during the early 1920s, some North African natives holding the local colonial citizenship applied for Italian metropolitan citizenship in Libya, and their applications for naturalization were successful. So they became Italian metropolitan citizens, joining the status of the Italians of Italy, the status of the colonizers. And who were these Libyan natives? The Inbetweens who crossed the juridical and imagined boundaries of Italian colonialism, navigating from the indigenous legal world to the metropolitan juridical space, and certainly going through a process of negotiation and strategies of identity belonging. These are two naturalization files that I have collected at the Central State Archive in Rome and that concern the two Libyan natives, Cesare Hassan and Gabriele Nahum, born and resident in Tripoli, and two natives who acquired Italian metropolitan citizenship in 1925. And these examples can be seen as historical cases of in-betweenness, I would like to emphasize a number of factors. First of all, these naturalization files are very useful sources of insights because they give us direct information on the reasons why Italian officialdom viewed these natives as worthy of getting the metropolitan status, of being elevated from the position of colonial citizens to the highest status of Italy's civic hierarchy, and of being included as members of the Italian national community into the sphere of the Italians of Italy. And which were the factors delineating the Italianità of these indigenous colonial natives and their being worthy of the metropolitan citizenship status? First of all, Italian education and upbringing. These Libyan applicants had gone through the Italian school system in the colony and held an Italian school diploma in Tripoli. So they could provide documented proof of their attachment to the language, education, and culture of Italy, the language and culture of the colonizing power. Also, all of them deserved the requested higher status because, according to Italian officialdom, they were worthy individuals from a moral point of view. They were politically loyal to Italy in a colony where anti-colonial resentment had been a constant menace for Rome, and they were dynamic natives, economically and professionally active, who were contributing to Italy's new colonial order, as Gabriele Nahum, for example, worked for the Italian colonial administration, and Cesare Hassan was an interpreter for the Italian colonial government in Tripoli. Seen as potential worthy members of Italy's national community and as useful intermediaries within the context of the colonial encounter, these natives speak to us today in another interesting way. They give us indirect hints about the will of some Libyan indigenous people who took the initiative to climb the juridical hierarchy put in place by the colonial state by submitting an application for naturalization. In effect, the administrative submission of a naturalization file indicates that colonial natives were not passive individuals, but rational actors who, in certain cases, even if in extremely infrequent cases, they knew how to exploit the window of political juridical opportunities open to them by the expanding colonial power. Now, beside the natives who were allowed to naturalize in Libya, I would like to discuss another type of in-betweenness by moving to East Africa and by focusing on the Italo-African children, so-called Medici, who personified the whole concept of colonial encounter. And here, a historical photograph can actually help. This photo, some of us have certainly seen it already, was taken in the early 1930s and was published in the pioneering book by Barbara Sorgoni. And who are the people, the people on the screen? In the middle, we see the Italian Navy official, Alberto Pollera, who was also a colonial administrator and a famous ethnographer, who lived and worked in Eritrea during the liberal and the fascist periods, as well as in Ethiopia. And here Pollera is together with two of his 6 Metis children, Giorgio on the left and Gabriele on the right. These 2 mixed-race sons were the offspring of an Italian citizen and an African woman. They were legitimized, legally recognized by their Italian father, Mr. Pollera, and they were therefore automatically granted Italian metropolitan citizenship because at that time, until 1939, paternal ius sanguinis plus legitimization or legal recognition by the Italian father made a Metis born in the colonies an Italian metropolitan citizen. But these 2 young and elegant Italian metropolitan citizens on the screen, how were they perceived by the Italian colonizers? How were they seen by the indigenous community? Were they regarded as Italian, as Africans, as both? And also from an individual point of view, how did these children interact with the 2 cultures and in some cases with the 2 legal worlds, the metropolitan and the African traditional legal space? If we take the example of Giorgio on the left, I have some biographical information that can help us reflect on issues concerning Meticiato, citizenship and identity in imperial settings. Giorgio was born in Asmara, went to Italian schools in the colony, and then completed his studies in Italy with the Salesiani order in Terni, and then in 1932-1933 at the Italian Military School for Ufficiali di Complemento in northern Italy. Also, and most importantly, in December 1935, during the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, Giorgio was 23 years old. He requested to be sent to East Africa as ufficiale volontario, as a volunteer, to fight for the fascist regime and to die for it, as Giorgio did during a battle against Ethiopians in December 1937. And 2 years later, in 1939, as reported in this Gazzetta Ufficiale of 15 June 1939, the fascist regime awarded him post-mortem the Gold Medal for Military Valor, and we can read on page 3 of the Gazzetta Ufficiale, Giorgio Pollera, first line, alla memoria, third line, to the memory, and the final line, it was an example of puro heroismo, pure heroism, as he died in December 1937. So the biological notes concerning Giorgio's life provide us with an example of a meticcio who represented and personified those tensions of empire I mentioned in the introduction. From his position of in-between, he united more than anyone else the worlds of the rulers and the ruled, thus threatening to blur the colonial divide. And from that same position of in-between, he also embraced juridical and cultural Italianità, as well as support for fascism, dying for it on the battlefield. Now, while Giorgio was legally legitimized by the Italian father and was granted Italian metropolitan citizenship, he went through an exceptional career path by studying and joining the army. Many more mixed-race children were unacknowledged and abandoned by their irresponsible Italian fathers, were not legally recognized by them, and in some cases they were left in the streets of Asmara and Mogadishu in miserable conditions to be raised in orphanages run by Catholic nuns and other missionaries. So all the Medici, those who acquired Italian metropolitan citizenship like Giorgio and those who did not, personified the Italo-African encounter. They upset with their presence the Eurocentric notion of power relations in colonial settings, and they certainly complicated the intertwined histories of colonialism, Italian citizenship, and Italian identity by simply linking Italy and Africa through their position of in-betweens. Now, from the angle of observation of the in-betweens of Italian colonial history, let's turn to the outs. And by moving to my second part, I would like to discuss them in contrast to the ins. Now, the various classifications of juridical statuses which characterize Italy's differential system of citizenship, colonial subjecthood during the interwar period were not fixed and unchangeable. In fact, the frontiers of inclusion and exclusion varied according to specific ideological priorities and racial criteria, changing even from one decade to the other. This means that the concept of alterity, colonial order, changed too in the course of the 1920s and the 1930s, following an official discourse about the perceived contrast and distance between ins and outs, which was by no means uncontested, and which evolved, taking a radical turn with the radical shift of the late fascist regime. Now, the targeted colonial orders whom I would like to discuss today, in contrast to the ins, are the Black Africans on the one side and the indigenous Jews on the other. Now, all of them were natives of the colonies. All of them held non-metropolitan statuses as a general rule, apart from the few exceptions I mentioned in the first part, and all of them can be related to the general phenomenon of Italian colonial racism in its anti-Black and anti-Jewish variants, a general phenomenon that we can summarize as follows. Italian colonial racism in its anti-Black and anti-Jewish dimensions involved references to biological factors, blood and skin color, but also cultural environmental factors such as language, civilization, psychological dispositions. So it included biological and non-biological aspects with variations according to the specific population and the historical decade under study. This phenomenon also took a variety of forms, ranging from racial stereotyping to radical institutionalized state racism, and it touched upon a variety of populations following the encounter of a perceived and never contested white race of the Italians with the Black races of Africa, the light-skinned races living in some parts of the East African continent, and the indigenous Jews across the empire. And finally, due to the specific context of Mussolini's regime and propaganda machine, the whole phenomenon of colonial racism was accompanied by the simultaneous shaping of a fascist notion of Italianità based on the brainwashing principle of Romanità. Now, bearing in mind Italian colonial racism in general, let's examine its anti-Black and anti-Jewish dimensions in more details. Now, first, the anti-Black colonial dimension of Italian colonial racism. I would like to emphasize two major aspects. Now, the racial discourses of Italian authorities, which I have examined in the course of my research, emphasize in different ways a perceived distance between the ins, the white Italian metropolitan citizens, and the outs, the Black African subjects. But we may ask, were the Italian colonizers really so white and so internally united as a national group? And thanks to the research of Professor Lisa Wong, Professor Patriarca, and Gaia Giuliani, we know that the origins of the Italians, the racial representations of Southern Italians as internal orders, and the whiteness of the Italians were by no means uncontested, and that most certainly The encounter with a visible colonial order has contributed to the strengthening of Italian national identity. Secondly, in reference to these visible African orders and to the black-white spectrum of color classification, it is also important to emphasize that Italian officialdom was first inspired by the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, according to which East Africans were not so distant from the Italians because they actually shared a common origin with them. But then from the mid-1930s onwards, following the radicalization of the regime, all the Africans were to be excluded and pushed back to their indigenous native world. So, in thinking and talking about this anti-Black variant of Italian colonial racism, it is important to bear in mind and highlight the complicated and contested cultural unity of the INS, as well as the variety and perceived differences concerning the African races. Now, as regards the anti-Jewish variant of Italian colonial racism, I would like to bring a couple of points of reflection. First, this type of racism targeted a tiny colonial minority within the Italian African Empire, while statistically anti-Black racism concerned larger majority groups. Also, to mention the research of Shira Klein from Chapman University, at times the indigenous Jews of the empire were victims of a double racism, the racism of non-Jew Italians and some racializing discourses of Italian Jews from the metropole who felt a sense of superiority vis-à-vis their co-religionists in the colonies. And thirdly, it was a type of Italian colonial racism that during the 1930s first discriminated Italy's own Jews in the metropole and then extended discrimination and persecution to the other territories of the empire. To give just two historical examples which help us to grasp the anti-Black and anti-Jewish variants up to 1939, I would like to mention these two infamous policies because they actually targeted both groups, Black Africans and indigenous Jews. So we have the infamous November 1938 decree law on the defense of the Italian race concerning the marriage between Italian Aryans and people belonging to another race, so including Jews and Black Africans. And the second example, January 1939, with the annexation of Libya to Italy, Libyan territory was incorporated to metropolitan Italy, but the Libyans did not become Italian metropolitan citizens following this annexation, and the Fascist Grand Council put forward both anti-Black and anti-Semitic considerations in order to reject any proposal to transform Libyans into Italian metropolitan citizens. So, to conclude, ins, outs, and in-betweens, all of them in different ways point to challenging factors that have made the interrelated concepts of citizenship and identity disputed and contested notions in the history of Italian colonialism. Between metropole and colonial Africa, the boundaries of citizenship were moving and changeable lines, which had a fundamental impact on the grammar of inclusion and exclusion of the Italian state, as well as being a fundamental identity factor for the individuals concerned. The ins, the outs, and the in-betweens, whom we have met today by talking about metropolitan citizens, colonial citizens, and naturalization policies, also indicate that citizenship and Italianità have gone through struggle and contestation. The Italians of Italy struggled to figure out who they really were. Were they Aryans? Were they Mediterraneans? Aryan Mediterraneans, fascist Romans. The in-betweens, with their dual identity, challenged unilateral notions of Italianness, and the outs, depicted as non-members and perceived as not belonging, were transformed into dangerous colonial others from whom to differentiate not so easily the Italian colonizers. And finally, I will ask Dante to conclude this presentation, because Dante has something to tell us about ideas of citizenship that we can then discuss in reference to the metropole and to the colonies, to the empire. In Paradise, we are in Paradise, canto number 8. Dante and Beatrice meet Carlo Martello d'Angiò, and Martello asks Dante, Ordì, sarebbe il peggio per l'uomo in terra se non fosse Cive. Now say, would it be worse for man on earth if he were not a citizen? And Dante replies, yes, e qui ragion non cheggio. Yes, and now for this and here I ask for no proof. Dante, The Divine Comedy, to all of you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina Donati, for your enlightening presentation. And our next speaker is Fiori Berhane. She teaches in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Southern California, where she is assistant professor. We have some in common because she got the PhD at Brown University. And now she's working on a project with the title Prisoner of Our Dreams, Eritrean Diaspora Politics in Red Italy. And this is her main topic. She's studying the history of international solidarities between Eritrean liberation movement and the Italian left, especially in the 1970s. She analyzed also the problem of the African and Eritrean refugees and the assistance that they obtain or not obtain in Italy and more in general in Europe. And I think she'll offer us the opportunity to reflect and reason on the issues relating to the decolonization and migration. Please welcome to Fiori Berhane.
So first, I would like to say thank you to Marla Stone for this very generative conference that has brought so many people who've been generative for my thinking over the years. And thank you to the staff at the American Academy for, it feels like it was only yesterday that I was here, for their warmth and generosity of spirit. I have the privilege of going last, and it is truly a privilege to to see the foundations for which this work was possible. So, like citizenship law itself, I have a kind of ad hoc and improvisatory nature, so the title has changed from the program. So I'm going to talk about Red Bologna and kind of recent discourses about the criminalization of solidarity. So I go this way. So in 2018, the group Eritrea Democratica, or Democratic Eritrea, organized a two-part memorial in the city of Bologna to those who had died in the October 3rd, 2013 disaster. Known as La Strage di Lampedusa, or this tragedy of Lampedusa, the shipwreck was at that time, quote, the most dramatic human disaster in the Mediterranean Sea since World War II. On October 3rd, 2013, in sight of land, 368 men, women, and children, all but 5 of whom were Eritrean, died in sight of land. Official and unofficial responses to the disaster emphasize the European nature of this tragedy, with Pope Francis inveighing against a culture of indifference to the suffering of others. Countless memorials across Europe have commemorated this tragedy, from the art installation piece Porta di Europa that stands on Lampedusa's beach to the Italian government's decision to mark October 3rd, a national holiday in memory of the victims of immigration. Yet, the Eritrea democratic action was distinct. It was the first institutionally sanctioned memorial on European soil in which those who belonged to communities facing border deaths guided the tenor of public commemoration. Eritrea Democratica was founded as a communications NGO to promote the human rights of Eritreans in Italy and to usher in a peaceful democratic transition in Eritrea. So Eritrea's refugee crisis, though, has been one of the top 10 crises of the world for the past 2 decades, yet it remains illegible to outsiders. As a peacetime country, it is one of the largest per capita producing refugees countries today, and in 2015, Eritreans were the single largest group to enter Italy by boat, representing 25% of arrivals. And this is remarkable given the small population of the country at about 3 million people. So rights groups often apportion blame for Eritrea's youth exodus on the Afwerki regime's policies of mass and indefinite military conscription. For months before the memorial, the group debated on the pragmatic, political, and discursive possibilities that the memorial presented. And in planning it, activists wrestled with the question of whom to address in their public interventions. Were they speaking directly to an Italian public or to an Eritrean diasporic one? Could they speak to both at once? Moreover, they wrestled with the question of who to apportion responsibility for the deaths of young Eritreans, European politicians or the Eritrean government. So in September of 2018, we sat together in a cafe attached to the local social center where the second memorial took place to take up these questions. My interlocutors debated about the limits of memorializing migrant death during a hostile political moment. Mahari and Tedros, university-educated leftists who arrived in Italy on student visas, were exceptional. Most of the members of the groups were Eritreans who had translated through the central Mediterranean. Both Mahari and Tedros believed that it was important to underscore Italy's and the EU's contemporary geopolitics in the Mediterranean for contextualizing the Lampedusa sinking. Quote, "You can't really stop traffickers by bombing them," Tedros began, in reference to the ongoing war in Libya and to the role the country had taken in Europe's war on smuggling. As the current conciliar for the Democratic Party of Italy, and as the first Black immigrant man to hold this position, Tedros understood the intricacies of local, national, and supranational migration policies. I read his comment as a sly nod to the EU-level discourse on the, quote, war on migrant smuggling that had come to dominate popular and institutional responses to the ongoing crisis. At both the national and international, supranational level, the response to the crisis focused on externalizing the EU's borders deeper into the Sahelian Africa and to prosecuting human smugglers wherever they may be. And I'll pause for a moment to discuss the case of Berhane Tesfa Mariam Berhe, who was an Eritrean refugee in Khartoum, who served 2 years in detention in prison in Sicily. It was a case of mistaken identity. He was confused for a trafficker and was extradited from Khartoum. He was actually a dairy farmer. So it's quite interesting that, when it comes to questions of legal jurisdiction, they can kind of fall apart in these places like Lampedusa, but when it comes to prosecuting trafficking, jurisdictions can really take on quite an ambit. So he continued, but what we should emphasize is freedom of movement. Mahari echoed Tedros' lines of reasoning by suggesting that the group, quote, show a picture of Berlusconi crying when Albanians died, and then juxtapose that to him signing the accords with Gaddafi, which I'll speak about later. Mahari laughed at the political impossibility that the gesture underscored. It was a blatant and blunt assessment of both the racialized double standards around whose lives were worthy of grieving, and a withering critique of Italy's neo-colonial policies in the Mediterranean. Indeed, his statement called forth a colonial history and post-colonial present that evaded recognition. The quote from Dan Stoller, "the enduring fissure of Italy's bygone empire." But as the Conversation continued. It was Johannes who voiced the painful memories of what the Lampedusa tragedy represented for the Eritrean diaspora. Johannes had survived the Mediterranean crossing after being conscripted in the Eritrean army and had endured various forms of detention, capture, and violence in his journey to Europe. He was often eloquent and forceful in speech and manner. He reminded the group that, quote, Isaias wants us to forget everything that has happened in the last 20 years. We are expected to live our lives the same way here. And later in the conversation, even when Lampedusa happened, the first thing that the Eritrean government said was illegal African migrants. They don't want us to name ourselves. Soon after the sinking, though, Eri TV, the Eritrean state's propaganda arm, broadcast news that, quote, illegal African migrants had died in the shipwreck. This statement effaced the lives of those Eritreans who died and denied Eritrea's ongoing crisis of depopulation. The statement also amplified a racial calculus in which illegal African migrant indexed expendable lives, lives unworthy of mourning. Johannes expressed indignation at the racist complicity of the regime and its continual effacement of its citizens. He pointed to the role of the Eritrean regime in surveilling and punishing its exiled populations, and in calling those who had died illegal African migrants, erasing the specificity of their histories and sacrifices. So notwithstanding a recognition of the racialized dimensions of whose lives were worth grieving, and saying they don't want us to name ourselves, Johannes makes an open demand for recognition that contemporary forms of migrant solidarity overlook. Johannes understood his life, his presence in Italy, and the presence of others like him, not as, quote, migrant lives, but as lives structured by the particular social, political, and historic circumstances specific to Eritreans. In countless public speeches, he would recount his journey to Italy as one that began with his grandfather, an Ascaro, who was conscripted to fight under Italian colonial rule in Libya, to his parents' sacrifices as guerrilla fighters during the 30-year war between Eritrean guerrillas and Ethiopia that would result in Eritrean independence, and to his own search for refuge. So instead of following a legible script as a migrant who suffered under bewildering and traumatizing circumstances, Johannes emphasized the unacknowledged historical relations that brought him to Italy. Tedros and Mahari instead did not rely to Johannes' sense of Eritrean nationalism. They had more cosmopolitan ties, and in some ways abstracted their relationship to migration and solidarity. But they all saw the call to name themselves as Eritreans as a demand for recognition as a historically situated political subject. It drew on long forgotten ties and solidarities, some deeply exploitative and violent, others once potent with the possibilities and perils of international solidarities that once existed between Eritreans and Italians. Johannes' demand, however, and the memorial more broadly, raises several questions. What does it mean to call on a history that few remember and a present marked by occlusion? How to memorialize ongoing violence? And quote, and how do subaltern subjects negotiate relations marked by, quote, uneven power relations and geographies in their efforts to generate new solidarities and political sensibilities? So I argue that Johannes' appeal worked to generate solidarities that are, quote, based in the active creation of new ways of relating, premised on an acknowledgement of historical humanity, a shared condition of interdependence grounded in history and politics. In turn, this grounding in history counters the dehistoricization of movements between Africa, Asia, and Europe that appeals for solidarity based on a transcendent, or what Andrea Mulbach calls bare humanity exhibit. Eritrean activists interrogate the silences and illusions of public and national memory, Eritrean and Italian alike, to chart a path forward in an unstable and charged present. They are historical actors who are, to quote Michel Rolfe-Trio, in constant interface with the context and as historical subjects, as voices aware of their vocality. Thus, the tragedy of Lampedusa was reappropriated by activists to symbolize not only the cruelty of the Eritrean regime, but to interrogate the ongoing regimes of violence Eritreans are subject to in migrating to Italy, and the silences and illusions that make that violence possible. activists linked Lampedusa to a longer colonial history and to the more recent history of political struggle and internationalist solidarities that connected Bologna and Eritrea to the spectacular violence of Europe's borders regimes. Moreover, their public and private conversations were forms of politicized and blame-seeking discourses that reframed the terms of racialized belonging, shifting a politics of, quote, irresponsibility shown by the Italian state towards migrants to one of historical and ethical indebtedness. In turn, the emphasis on historical responsibility creates forms of relationality foreclosed by appeals to a transcendent, dehistoricized humanities that structures contemporary appeals to migrant solidarity. So why would a memorial, so the Ascaris from 1909, so why would a memorial of this type for the October 3rd sinking take place in Bologna, a northern Italian city unaffected by the daily catastrophes and disembarkations that frontline communities in Sicily and Lampedusa experience? So the answer to this question lies in the specific political history that connects Bologna to the Eritrean diaspora. So once regarded as, quote, the capital of Eritreans in exile, and this was a letter that I found from Isaias Afwerki, current president, to the mayor of Bologna, Walter Vitali, in 1990. Bologna had been the site for the making of political solidarities between Eritrea's guerrillas and segments of Italy's left beginning in the 1970s. The administration of the city of Bologna hosted Festival Eritrea, a diasporic political festival organized by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front that ran from 1974 until Eritrea's de facto independence in 1991. Indeed, at its first Congress in 1974, the EPLF chose Bologna as its permanent seat. Eritrean activists, aware of this history, centered Bologna as the site of diasporic political organizing against the regime of Isaias Afwerki. Eritrea's modern history, though, begins as Italy's primogenita, or its firstborn colony. From 1890 to 1941, the territory was under Italian control until Italy lost its colonies following the Treaty of Albania. From 1941 to 1951, the territory was put under British trusteeship. Then it was federated to Ethiopia, and in 1961, Emperor Haile Selassie forcibly annexed the territory. So from 1961 to 1991, Eritrean guerrilla groups, the Eritrean Liberation Front, and then the Maoist-Leninist Eritrean People's Liberation Front fought against successive Ethiopian regimes. So estimates put the number of Eritreans displaced during the war to close to 1/3 of the population, and there are estimates that about 50% of Eritrea's population lives abroad. So during this generative moment, the EPLF sponsored exile festivals, maintained political offices in cities like Rome and Washington, D.C., and symbolically and materially united its exile population in a project of state building from afar. Nowhere was this project of state building in exile most pronounced than in Bologna. So during Bologna's August holiday, representatives from the EPLF's front, other representatives from third world liberation movements, Italian leftists, and other anti-colonials, alongside the significant numbers of displaced Eritreans, would gather in Piazza Maggiore, the city square, for festivities and political education that fostered a long-lasting sense of comunitas. The festival would bring upwards of 10,000 Eritreans from across Europe and the Middle East. Indeed, in 1974, the local administration of Renato Zangari was the first Italian municipality to aid the EPLF by providing medical care and supplies, transfer of funds, and the support necessary to maintain the festival for its 25-year existence. This was only possible because of Italy's comune system, or its system of municipalities, which gave municipalities, quote, city-state status. And although Italy's official foreign policy towards Eritrean independence was conservative, quote, this is from Corrado Tornembeni, PC governed municipalities in particular pursued their own foreign policy, often but not always in agreement with the national leadership of the PC. So apart from a few white Italian leftists who were directly involved with the movement, only a handful of white Bolognese I encountered throughout fieldwork even knew of these festivals. So notwithstanding this localized historical amnesia on the part of white Italians, Eritrean diasporic identities continue to be marked by this historical moment and the local placemaking practices that took place under the auspices of the EPLF. But this also extends to Eritrea proper.
For example, following formal independence in 1993, the only street in Asmara, the capital city of Eritrea, that maintained its original Italian name is Via Bologna. The PFDJ, the party that emerged, it's called the Party for Democracy and Justice, and there are many jokes about that name. The party that emerged from the EPLF has metonymically linked Bologna to the nationalist war, substituting and mobilizing a colonial relation in service of what Mia Fuller calls postcolonial capital. She writes that colonial nostalgia is actively cultivated by Eritrean ruling elites who, quote, manipulate this heritage's value for national sentiment and ultimately ruthless domestic control. Eritreans have likewise forgotten Italian colonialism, but for distinct ideological and material needs from their Italian counterparts. So for my interlocutors, making visible these long-standing ties between Eritrea and Italy was part of their self-conscious construction as political subjects. Their claims to solidarity stand in part from an inheritance taken from a complex and specific history between Eritrea and Italy. Eritrean history, though, is a history that confounds most teleologies of postcolonialism. First, Eritreans did not fight against Italians for an independent nation state. Instead, they fought Ethiopians, with whom they shared significant cultural and linguistic ties. Indeed, an earlier generation of Eritreans was mobilized to fight Ethiopians during Italy's invasion and occupation of that country from 1935 to 1941. Rural Eritreans were recruited en masse to fight colonial wars in Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And second, following Italy's defeat in World War II, few Eritreans or other post-colonial subjects migrated to Italy as other post-colonial migrants to Great Britain or France had. The only exception was a small number of Eritrean women who were recruited by Catholic employment agencies as live-in domestics during the 1970s and 1980s. So support for the Eritrean liberation movement emerged during the apex of internationalism. And with a large and comparatively powerful communist party, Italians created and nurtured solidarity networks with other African decolonizing movements. In Italy, however, anti-colonial solidarity grew in tandem with collective colonial amnesia, in which the prevailing ideology of the time was that the Italian nation was, to quote Mia Fuller, never to have had colonies. Relatedly, Eritrean guerrilla groups and intellectuals argued for Eritrean nation-state status by making the claim that, quote, a colony equals a state, that the legal, political, and social bases of Eritrean state had stemmed from Italian colonization, and that Ethiopian rule was a form of, quote, African colonialism. In countless documents I examined at the various archives I visited across Bologna, Rome, and Milan, nowhere do Eritrean nationalists, nor their Italian supporters of the 1970s, mention Italian colonialism. This elision intrigued me for several reasons. In both the Eritrean and Italian context, colonial aphasia, what Ann Stoler calls colonial aphasia, or the loss of access, or an active dissociation of the colonial past, conditioned the possibilities of leftist solidarities between Eritrean guerrillas and Italian leftists. But colonial amnesia wasn't solely an imposition from above. The Italians standing in solidarity who were quoted in archives were activists, intellectuals, local government officials, and often regular people. Some were passionately committed to the South African anti-apartheid movement. Their commitment to the Eritrean movement and its discursive construction reflects the ways in which historical silences do not simply reproduce the overt political positions of historical actors, to quote Michel Rolfe-Trio again. And rather than view the claim of African colonialism as solely instrumental on the part of Eritrean nationalists, I understand it as reflecting the limited discursive tools that they had at that time. Calling Ethiopia's total war against Eritreans colonial made the call to solidarity legible during a time at which the complicated and internecine violence that gripped the decolonizing war was unintelligible to most sympathetic Western observers. So Bologna specifically was a node in a nexus of transnational solidarities with African anti-colonial movements like Mozambique's modernist revolutionary movement Frelimo that emerged from the 1970 Rome Conference. So this set of contradictions paved the way for solidarities that were messy, paradoxical, and freighted with the echoes of an unassimilated colonial past. Notwithstanding these tensions, the period was marked by a hope of possible futures that refugees, exiles, guerrilla fighters, and European supporters alike shared. Unfortunately, the euphoria and grand hopes that independence ushered were soon overtaken by the 1998-2000 border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Following that war, independent media was shuttered in Eritrea, government ministers were detained indefinitely and disappeared, and the duration of military conscription increased from 18 months to lasting throughout much of a conscript's adult lives. For the generation that came of age during the Nationalist War, the recent post-2001 migration of young Eritreans is discursively cast as a betrayal of the nation and the sacrifices of the martyrs of the revolution. Thus, Eritreans who challenge the hegemony of the EPLF, or the Party for Democracy and Justice, are deemed un-Eritrean and find themselves surveilled by party members in exile. Put simply, Eritreans are active creators and victims of state power abroad. So therefore, for local activists, the seemingly innocent act of memorializing the Lampedusa sinking held high political stakes, stakes that were not apparent to outsiders. So the first planning meeting for the memorial took place in September 2017 with the city government. That initial meeting focused on the logistics of when and where the memorial would take place. The members of Eritrea Democratica had agreed with city government on a two-part memorial spaced 6 months apart. Yet this agreement did not come without conditions. The president of the neighborhood instructed my interlocutors that the memorial was, quote, not to make a statement on immigration, but rather to facilitate integration. The neighborhood president also advised that any use of visual monuments should be, quote, secure for children, and not to be, quote, sad. The art installation was meant to, quote, make memory in our parks to be a lived-in space in which Tedros, the head of the NGO, emphasized that, quote, one lives that moment, Lampedusa, through the monument. While these lofty declarations of what the memorial should achieve were being discussed, the park administrator reminded the group that they alone were responsible for cleaning and maintaining the artwork. At first, I believed that Tedros agreed wholeheartedly with this act of depoliticization. I was confused. As Tedros explained to me, his work with Eritrea Democratica was a matter of solidarity. He didn't struggle, or tchlas, out of necessity. Instead, he stood with Eritreans and Eritrea proper, and with those who had recently survived the Mediterranean crisis as a matter of conscience. So nevertheless, his political and affective commitments were split between his labor as an advocate for migrant integration in Italy and as someone deeply committed to a peaceful democratic transition in Eritrea. As both a member of Rete Jitu and as a liaison between the NGO and the local government, he strove to strike a balance between not only advocating for migrants and Eritreans more broadly, but in maintaining strategic alliances between various stakeholders in the city government that work to advocate for migrant rights. However, the two memorials transpired across a political moment that damaged Tedros's humanist faith. Indeed, Eritrean Italians were wary of Italian solidarity and integration for a reason. It began to fall apart with an uptick in anti-Black violence. They were treading a fine line between trying to work towards integration and forge solidarity with recent migrants, as well as sympathetic Italians. My interlocutors grew disenchanted with the promise of integration, following the high-profile shootings and daily assaults on Black Italians. They also understood that there was greater force in numbers, creating pragmatic... 2 minutes? Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna get... Okay. So I'll talk about the illegal African migrant, and then I'll just do 2 parts. So migrant solidarity work threatened to erase the specificity of the history that brought Eritreans and Italians together, a fraught history that the Eritrean regime elided in naming those who died in Lampedusa as illegal African migrants. So illegal African migrant not only indexed the erasure of the history of Italian colonialism, but also the terms through which transracial solidarities could be built. The illegal African migrant became the figure of abjection and rightlessness, the figure which united Europe in its war against migrants. But it wasn't so easy to call out the racist connotations of this description. For the Italian right, African migration represented a conspiracy to replace the white working class. The discourses that supported this belief were called Rosso-Brunismo, which involves the decontextualized appropriation of anti-colonial, pan-Africanist, and Marxist discourses in the service of justifying racist policies. Indeed, at that time, Matteo Salvini, the leader of the anti-immigration party, the Northern League, campaigned on the promise to stop African migrations using Marx's concept of the reserve army of labor. So I'll stop that. And then, so these ideological currents converged in March of 2018 that we've all talked about. So at that time, the group seized upon the opportunity to memorialize ongoing violence that included violence at home, in transit, that I'll talk about, and upon settlement. So the reintroduction of the border externalizing deals between Italy and Libya in late 2017 gave a new political urgency to the event that took place on October 2018. For the second memorial, each member was instructed to give a piece of the puzzle. So one of the central pieces of that puzzle was, quote, what was happening in Libya. Since the early 2000s, Libya has served as a partner to Italy in combating illegal migration. In 2008, Silvio Berlusconi and Muammar Gaddafi signed the Friendship Accords, the model for the Memorandum of Understanding that would later be put in place by the Democratic Party of Italy. The Friendship Accords were the first public acknowledgement of any Italian head of state of Italian colonial crimes in Italy's African empire. And the deals provided Libyan authorities with 5 billion euros in funds for key infrastructure projects. As part of the stipulation for the deals, Italian oil and gas firms were given preferential exploration rights to Libyan oil fields. And through a kickback mechanism, profits from oil were then reinvested to build migrant detention centers, of which Italian construction firms had the exclusive rights. So symbolically, the deals were meant to close, quote, the painful colonial past and open a new chapter for the two countries. And at the time, the New York Times described the deals as colonial reparations. So I will, there was a lot more, but I will just,
read the book.
yeah, I'll just read my last paragraph. This is my concluding idea. I did not. So just one last point. So in analyzing the production of Italian colonial amnesia at distinct historical junctures and across disparate scales and amongst diverse actors, I became attuned to the unexpected discourses, political alliances, and historical contingencies that frame, quote, solidarity. Put simply, solidarity was messy business. On a broader level, though, tracing the historical continuities, ruptures, and recursions of Italy's relations with its former colonies should alert scholars to the fact that coloniality is not an ambient presence, a trace, an echo, or a resonance, nor are the consequences of colonial violence predetermined or teleological. Instead, coloniality is an iterative process, an actively reworked and productive relation situated in time and place. Moreover, without an account that traces these fluid constellations of power and the critical responses to them, we risk reifying migrant exclusion under theoretical paradigms that naturalize state and sovereign power. The political actions of my interlocutors exceed the migrant-citizen binary. Perhaps our analytical tools should follow.
Thank you, Fiori Berhane. I think I find very interesting your presentations, especially because the interconnection between international, national, and local, I think, is a very important point of view. I think also that maybe some special place, for example, Lampedusa, are special for geographical reason, but other special places are special for the rule of some politicians. We have the Bologna of Zangrandi. We have the Florence of La Pira. We have Arezzo of Fanfani. And so it's important to try to understand the rule of these politicians, and also the connection in this case between Catholics and the Bologna the Red, no? Bologna la Rossa, and the Communist Party, especially about solidarity and citizenship. And now I think we have 50 minutes? No more?
We have like 5 because we want
5.
a little
Okay,
break.
sorry. 5 minutes for this. 10.
All right, what?
10.
Maybe we'll start the keynote at 6:05. We'll do 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Yes, one, and then.
I have a question for both of you, and it has to do basically with the prospects for, let's call it, racial integration in Italy. So, from the point of view of your research, I mean, it seems to me that the picture that was provided by the first presenter, is one in which colorism, leaving aside the Jewish stuff, is, it's a familiar sort of pattern of discrimination, really worldwide. And, darker people tend to be discriminated against by lighter-skinned people. It's not the only way this is done. But one of the things that, is at the bedrock, I think, of racial discrimination in the United States is this so-called one-drop rule that we have, and which the Nazis borrowed to figure out who was Jewish. So, this has been a really kind of difficult nut to crack, but it's not to say that there's been no progress with the black population in the United States either, right? I mean, there are some who have, made it into a black middle class, which is now a not insignificant part of the social structure. So I'm sort of wondering, how do you see the prospects for, I mean, one of the major kinds of things that would play a role here is intermarriage, right? And the sort of production, so to speak, of, we would say in the United States, biracial children. And so, the population would get more and more diverse, and, there would be more sort of integration. So I'm just curious, from the perspective of your, in certain ways, very diverse, kinds of research, I'd be interested to know what you think of the prospects of that.
So, I mean, I think the point that I try to make is that integration is a kind of a political process that's not, and that my interlocutors are trying to counter various types of essentialisms and elisions and kind of collapsing of categories. So Camilla Hawthorne has written about how migrant interpolated postcolonial was an interpolation of the Italian state that made sure that erased the history of Italian colonialism and denied the existence of postcolonial subjects. And in the case of Eritrea, there has been long-standing patterns of interracial marriage, migrations. People also do marry interracially here in Italy and adopt transracially, but that doesn't necessarily, intimate lives are also politically structured, but that doesn't necessarily shift the politics of the state. So these are processes that are historically contingent and situated in time and place. So I do think, I don't think that my interlocutors act out of hopelessness, right? They engage in public education programs, and this was a public intervention. The fact that they were able to do this in a context where migrants have very little formal political participation shows that, that we can't deny agency even within constraints in a kind of fraught political process at this moment. So I share their kind of Gramscian orientation, optimism of the will. What is it? Pessimism of the intellect? Yes. So that's where I'll leave my comments.
Yeah. I just would like to add a point to Professor Torpi's comment. You mentioned the color line. The color line has always been a fundamental factor of inclusion and exclusion, and in the Italian case, it has not concerned the fascist period only. It's really something that goes back to the very early years of post-unification history, and it has also been connected to, you mentioned the intermarriage issue. In the context of the colonies, it was really discussed in reference also to the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, according to which some African tribes of the east part of the African continent were not so distant vis-à-vis the Italians. So it was a way of making distinctions among the various African tribes and classifying them according to racial and civilizational principles. So it is something that the color line has always shaped Italian citizenship and identity since the very early years of post-unification history, and I see this factor continuing in post-colonial Italy too. So a different context, but it seems to me that the logic behind has many similarities with the past, both the past of liberal Italy and fascist Italy.
The last question?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for both of you about the role of the Catholic Church or Catholic associations in either aiding racialized subjects or, on the other hand, on reinforcing racial discrimination. You both mentioned at various points Catholic associations bringing over Eritrean women, in Fiori's case, in Sabina's case, these Catholic orphanages that feed refugee children. So anything about Catholic Church?
Can I? So the kind of contradictions of Red Bologna is that it's very communist and it's very Catholic. And the Catholic Church contains all of the kind of contradictions. It's capacious enough to have everything, right? But, there were... the Comuniani missionaries were deeply anti-colonial, and they had missions in Eritrea. But more broadly, the Catholic Church, especially in the 1990s when Albanian vote migration became a problem or an emergency, was really responsible for building the apparatus of kind of migrant detention centers across the country, like of camps, right? This comes from Maurizio Al-Bahari's work. So there is a kind of, part of the kind of orientation even in the Italian but legal documents towards welcoming welcoming is kind of considered a kind of act of charity and witnessing Catholic charity, etc. But these contradictions, I think at least, the Eritreans I worked with were instrumental in having Eritreans be recognized under the humanitarian corridor program that selected 1,000 Syrians and 500 Eritreans and transported them from the camps in Beirut and Addis Ababa, like in Ethiopia, and Lebanon and Ethiopia respectively, for evacuation to Italy, which is quite, and gave them all these kind of support services. So, with the Catholic employment agencies, though, that would take a bit more work, but most of the women who came in the 70s were recruited through these domestic. And then there's work by Jacqueline Andal about all of this, but I'll just stop there.
Yes, I just would like to add 2 points. The Catholic Church role during the colonial period, it was very important. First of all, the cross followed the flag. So it's really Catholicism, the Catholic Church and Catholic priests used, following the flag and the troops, used the the logistics of the Italian colonizers arriving in a territory, because obviously they had the mission of spreading the word of God, the Catholic one. And they also had a very important role in raising mixed-race children in orphanages. And there is an article by Valentina Fusari, a recent article on orphanages, mixed-race children raised there, where she emphasizes the expression of colpe colorate that I also found in Professor Badiarca's article, Brown Babies. These children were defined as colored girls because they were illegitimate children and also of mixed race. And finally, I just would like to mention the important role of the Catholic Church and of Catholicism in having an impact on anti-Semitism. The book by David Kurtzer, the Popes Against the Jews, there we have the important example of the Jesuit Civiltà Cattolica, where there were many articles emphasizing and targeting the Jews, using all the stereotypes we know, a tiny minority who were emancipated, and there was an issue of giving so many rights to the Jews because despite being a tiny minority, the Jews held very important positions at the parliamentary level and within Italian society.
Thanks.
So I see, yes.
I am really sorry that we have had several times to cut off questions. I think it proves Fiori's point that this has been an incredibly generative and productive conversation. I hope that the questions can be followed up on at the reception and even at dinner. But let's take a few minutes, clear our heads, get ready for our keynote and our closing tonight. So let's come back at 6:05. Okay.